Let's see how we can apply functions on records of data frames and series objects. So suppose we want to take the values of the resolution column. Now, to remind you, the resolution column, let's print it. So you can see that it's actually a string. It's not necessarily, so for some records, you get a number, which I think is the number in angstrom of the resolution of the X-ray that was used to determine the structure of the record. But for some other values, you get some different kind of value. So it's not necessarily a number. Now let's say that we want to process the data a little bit. For each record, we want to get that as a number. And if it's not a number, we'll just put a none, an invalid value within it. So we can define a function that for each row resolution, which is a string, we'll try to convert it to a float. And if that doesn't work, if we get a value error, we'll return just not a number. Now, if we want to apply that function on all of the values of this column, we have actually a very simple way to do that. We can use the apply function. So that's a functional programming kind of syntax. So that's a function that accepts another function and uses it to perform its operation. So df resolution will give us the values of the resolution column. And then the apply function, given this new function of the parse resolution, will apply the parse resolution on each of the values of this series. And you can see that what we get is a new series with the same index. So the nice thing about apply is that it retains the original index. And it only applies on the values. So for each value, we'll get the output of this function. So that's actually a very neat way to modify existing values within a data frame using pretty much any Python code that you want to run. Okay? So it might not seem that way, but actually apply is a very useful function. And it takes time to getting used to, but when you do get used to it, it's a very nice way to manipulate values. Now, very often we can use apply to modify the values of an existing columns, and then we can assign it to a different column or override the existing column. So for example, we may want to take this resolution, we want to do some parsing to it, and then taking the parsed values and to override the original resolution column. And that's what we see here. So now we change the data frame to have the resolution as numbers with the parsed resolution. And this is the apply when we do it on a series object. We can also use an apply on a data frame. And this time we can manipulate whole records at a time to create new values. For example, we may want to create a get taxonomy function which doesn't depend just on one column, but on 3 different columns. So for each record, we want to access the genome and a family and a genus of these records. And from this, we want to create this new taxonomy field. So to do that, we will use df apply on the entire data frame, not a specific column. And then we'll give it a get taxonomy function. And very importantly, we'll state that we want it on the columns axis, which is axis 1. OK, so you can write your columns, or you can just write one. Both ways work the same way. And that's actually important because by default, the apply function will work. It will work per column, not per row. So if you want it row-wise, as you usually do, you need to explicitly state that you want axis 1. And then this will return you a new string value for each record, which is, again, the result will be a series with the same index. So it will, again, retain the index of the original data frame. And will just give you new values, which are whatever values you created here. And then you can assign it to a new column and create, say, the taxonomy column, like you see here. And now for each record, you have this taxonomy according to this format of the function that we wrote. OK, so again, a very useful way to take values of different columns and somehow combine them together into a new value. Of course, now if you can do that using vectorized operations, so if we were just, I don't know, adding or subtracting numbers, of course, it would be better just to use the vectorized arithmetics, which is more efficient and easier. But sometimes we don't have a vectorized operation for the thing we want to do that depends on multiple columns. And then we can use the apply function instead, where we can actually specify any Python code for taking the different values and manipulate them and combine them together and get the kind of new output that we want. Questions? OK, so like the apply, we also have the apply map function, which what it does, instead of working row-wise or column-wise, it will actually work value-wise. So it will be applied independently to each value in the data frame, no matter what column it came from. So typically, it only makes sense if your data frame has one data type. So if you have mixed data types, it doesn't make sense usually to apply the same function over all of the values. But for example, if we take only the three numeric columns of inner, outer, and average radiuses, and we want to apply some function of them. For example, if it's bigger than 200, we want to write big, and if it's smaller, we want it to be small. We can use the apply map, which gets this function here using the lambda syntax. And you see that we get this new data frame with this function applied to each and every value within this data frame. OK, so a few more small stuff with data frames. We have the count function, which gives us the count for every entry. Now, if you don't have any missing values, it will just be the length of the data frame for all the columns. But for some values which have missing values, for example, in the resolution, we had some nans within it, it will just give us the number of values which are not missing, so are not NumPy nan or Python none values. And you can use the standard deviation, the mean, the median, and it will work column-wise. So for each column, sorry, it will work row-wise. So for each column, it will do this aggregation across the rows. So the STD will give you the standard deviation of each of the columns across all the rows, and likewise for all the other statistical functions. Another function is the transpose, which what it does, it transposes the data frame, turning the columns into rows and the rows into columns. And then you can get a new data frame. And now the index is what used to be the columns. And the columns is what used to be the index. OK. And missing data. So we saw that the resolution column has some missing values. We have those nans in it. And it's very common that we have missing values in our data, and we need to handle it in some ways. So if we just leave them there, it might interfere with the kind of operation or analysis that we want to do. So there are many options to work with missing values, and Pandas actually gives us quite a good functionality to handle them. The first thing we may want to have is some way of determining which value is missing. For that, we have the isNull function, which, given a series or a data frame, will give us the same series with the same index, where for each value, it will give us a Boolean value saying whether it's missing or not, whether it's null or not. So you can see that for all the actual numbers, we get false. And where we have nan, we get a true. And correspondingly, we have the not null function, which gives just the opposite. So it's like using the not over the isNull function, just with one function. And yeah. another thing we might want to do is just to get rid of the null values. So for that, we don't have to first use the not null and then to use that to slice the not null values. We can do that just in one function, which is called the drop NA. So this will automatically drop everything that has a null value. So you can see it returns 0, 1, and 2, but the 3, it drops, and then we have 4, and 5 and 6 are also dropped because there are nans. And another thing we might want to do is just to treat the missing values as some kind of a default. So we may say that everything that is missing, by default, we want to treat it like 0. And for that, we have the fill NA function, which we can give it some default value, and everything that is missing will be assumed to be this default value. So we get a new series, and you can see that everything that used to be nan is now 0. Now, these two functions also work on data frames, not only on series. So for a data frame, it will just drop every row that has any missing value. It doesn't matter in which column. You can also specify an argument saying that you want it to look only at specific columns. But if you don't specify anything, it will look at all the columns and drop everything that has any missing value. And similarly, you can use the fill NA, which again, no matter in which column, it will put a 0 every time that you have something missing. So let's see a concrete example of how we can use these functions. So let's say we want to create a new column saying whether we have a good resolution for this virus. And we define a good resolution to be anything that is between 0.5 to 2. Now, if we have a missing value, we don't want to get an error. We just want to treat it as a bad resolution. The way we can do that is to use the fill NA, and then to give some value, doesn't matter which, as long as it's outside of the range that we want to check. And if we, for example, put 10, then it will be outside of the 0.5 to 2 range. And then it means that everything that is nan will become false. And you see that we get this new field saying whether each record is good resolution or not. And then we can, for example, use it to query a specific record from the data frame. So we can take the data frame and use the good resolution as a mask, giving us only the rows which have true in this column. And we get just, what is it, 5 rows which have good resolution according to this definition. Questions?
Why did you put 10 in the fill NA?
Yeah, OK. So it actually doesn't matter. Like, I could put here also like 100. So as long as it's outside of the range that I'm trying to check, it works.
So it's the between creates like a Boolean factor?
Yeah. Yeah, so between is a function that gets 2 arguments, and we give you a Boolean for each value. It's true only if it's between these 2 values. Yeah. OK, now you may remember that when we spoke about NumPy last week, we mentioned the isNan function of NumPy. And now we have the isNull function of Pandas. They're a bit similar but different. So let's see that. So I wrote some code here that checks all of the options. So you can see what each of the functions does for each value that it gets. So you can see that if we have a nan, then it doesn't matter. If we use isNull of Pandas or isNan of NumPy, we get true. And if we give it some number which is not a nan, we get false for either of these 2 options. But if we give it something that is not a number, then if we use the isNull, it actually gives us some result. Whereas if we use the isNan of NumPy, we get an error. OK, so the isNan of NumPy only works for numbers. Whereas the isNull is more general than that. It works for other values as well. So we have the Python none, which for the sake of the isNull function is also treated as a null, whereas for isNan it just gives an error. And if you give some other object which is not a nan and not a none, then you will just get false for isNull, but you will get, again, an error if you use the isNan of NumPy. So generally, the isNull function of Pandas is more general, and I think it's better to use it because it works for more cases. Whereas the isNan of NumPy is more restricted to numbers. OK. Last thing I want to cover before we move to the lab exercise is how we do sorting. OK, so for the sake of this example, let's, again, take the data frame and index it by the entry ID. And let's take the subunits column. OK, so we get a subunits indexed by the entry ID. Now, if we want to sort it, we have two functions that we can use. Most commonly, we want to sort things by their values. So we can use the sort values function, which given a series will give us a new series with the same entries, just sorted in the different ways, sorted by their values in this case. So you can see that now the first record that we get is the one with the lowest value, and then the second lowest, and so on. We can also get that in reversed order using the ascending equals false, and then we'll get it in descending order, starting from the highest to the lowest. And sometimes we don't want to index by the values. We want to we don't want to sort by the values. We want to sort by the index, and then we can just use the sort index function. And in our case, we have an index which is strings, so it will be sorted alphabetically, and we'll get a series sorted by this alphabetical order of the entry ID. If we want to sort a data frame, it works much the same way, just that we need to specify according to which column we want the sorting to be. So we can take a data frame and use the sort values and specify a concrete column that we want to sort by. So in this case, we want to sort the data frame according to the genus. And you see that's what happens. Sorry, by the genome in this case. Or again, you can use the sort index to sort the data frame by its index.